By recording to the computer. Just wait a moment or two for anyone who is joining us. With only 15 shopping days until Christmas. Very nerve-wracking time. Very nerve-wracking. All right, so at 6 p.m. Eastern Australian Summertime, welcome to this Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia webinar on the wrap-up to come of the environmental negotiations that have been going on in the last quarter of 2024. Welcome to our conversation with myself, Andrew Peterson, the CEO of the BCSDA Australia, and colleagues Murray Griffin from earth.au and Ilona Miller from Gilbert and Tobin. On the screen, you will see the agenda, which is a quick acknowledgement to country, and then we'll go into a quick state of play update from my good self, and then we'll go into a reflections Q&A with our two guest speakers. So, in opening, I wish to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the land of the Camaragal people and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and particularly welcome any Torres Strait Islanders or Aboriginal people who may be either joining us for the meeting or watching the recording following this webinar. So, very interesting quarter this year because there were a significant number of environmental negotiations being held around the world at a critical moment in time, geopolitically, but also environmentally. And with that, a interesting insight into where we're at with those negotiations, as we'll get to very shortly. But I wanted to explain the asterisk in the heading, being the COPs with an asterisk. And we will, as we are going through this discussion, highlight that one wasn't actually technically a COP, or what's called a Conference of the Party, but one that was anticipating to be so. And yet there is work to be done as a result of the negotiation outcome. So the first COP, the first Conference of the Parties that I wanted to talk about was that of the Biodiversity COP, which was held in Cali in Colombia, late October, early November. And this was the first COP since the groundbreaking 2022 Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework outcome that happened at COP 16. It's COP 15 rather. And with this, almost a where are we at? What's next? What are the ambitions that are going to be in terms of implementation of the targets that were set under the framework? And just as critically, as we'll see in relation to the climate COP, where's the money going to come from to finance the implementation tasks? Now, what's interesting about this particular COP is that not a lot happened, regrettably, but that which did happen was not insignificant. The first two, or the first outcome, was that of a formal recognition for the first time in COP history, not just in this COP, but in the other pillars of the environmental negotiation process, the recognition and the empowerment of Indigenous peoples and local communities into the participation of the negotiation process has now happened. So this is going to be an important development going forward as to how that works, what role they play in relation to that, and what are the outcomes as a result of that have an impact not only for domestic or national policy, but also for business implementation. The other was a little more targeted, which was the confirmation of a new platform called the Digital Sequencing Information Benefit Sharing. And what this is, as it says on the screen, is an establishment of a mechanism for equitable sharing of benefits from the commercial use of digital sequence information. Now, this could be information that comes from particularly plant and habitat in Indigenous peoples or local community spaces. And therefore, the creation of this fund will need to channel benefits back to those particular IPLCs or developing countries. Now, what they didn't agree on, though, was just as significant, namely lack of consensus on how they were going to mobilise several $billion worth of funds by 2025, and the aspiration for $30 billion by 2030 for biodiversity support. Equally disappointing was the lack of agreement on enhancing global monitoring frameworks to assess the progress towards the targets. But as we've seen in recent days, there is a commitment to return to a further conference in February of next year, and I think it's going to be held in Rome, to actually prosecute and address the unresolved issues, particularly the ones around financial mobilisation. And there will be an update on the review of the progress at the next biodiversity conference, which will be held in 2026, which at that point will be held in Armenia, to look at the collective progress towards the goals and the targets. And the reason for this is because of the perceived and in some cases actual failure of the last set of targets that were set under the Archie targets from 2010 through to 2020. And so this time they're going to actually undertake this review a lot earlier than they have in the past. What this means for business is, and this is our understanding of some of the significance of it, is that biodiversity-intensive sectors like pharmaceuticals, agriculture, mining and forestry are going to have to think quite seriously about what was agreed to and start to think about the actions that they might need to build into their responses to that, particularly when it comes to the IPLC, or the Indigenous Peoples and local communities roles, because they'll have a seat at the table at ongoing negotiations rather than being, as is the past and is still true of the private sector, a observer too, but not necessarily a speaker at or being able to influence directly the negotiations. The other will obviously be the benefit sharing that comes from digital sequencing information, because this is not mandatory, it's only at this stage voluntary. And so that there are other issues in relation to financial mobilisation for biodiversity, and obviously the transparency and monitoring and reporting that will come to be, that we'll look at should February of next year actually produce an outcome. Now, the one that COP that everybody knows is that of the climate COP. And this year it was held in Baku in Azerbaijan. It was held barely 10 days after the the biodiversity COP rather. And this COP had really one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to really engage and step up the form of and create scale around climate financing. And in this particular case, as we'll see in a minute and have a discussion with our august speakers, it didn't really quite get there. But it did have an important grounding in relation to what was actually achieved. There was also important conversations around loss and damage, and as we'll see in a minute, the agreements that were made included almost the first few hours of the COP opening, an agreement around the global carbon market. And I'm hoping that Elena will be able to give us some more intelligence in relation to what the significance of that means when we get to the reflection section. We did see, though, there was a climate finance package offered. And in this particular case, on this occasion, there was a commitment by wealthy nations to, quote, commit to about $300 billion per annum, with an aspiration of potentially getting to somewhere in the order of $1 trillion over the forward estimates of the COP negotiations, however that may manifest itself. But what we didn't really see was any significant outcomes other than that. And this is kind of a bit of a warning signal to what might be the future, or might be the possibility of an outcome at COP30, which is the next COP next year in 2025, which will be held in Brazil, where there's a lot of expectation that this COP, the next COP, will have a lot of ambition injected into it for the future target setting under the Paris Agreement. And so little disappointing that we didn't see perhaps as much progress as a lot of commentators would have liked to have seen. And certainly from the calls from business, that these sort of things should have been dealt with at this COP rather than necessarily trickling into and perhaps weighing down the expectations of what the next COP might actually turn out to deliver in terms of the ambition that it wants to set. What we do know, though, is that there's going to be some preparatory action in relation to new consultation, again, happening sometime in February before they have what's called the intersessional meetings in June. And we are likely to see some further implementation on the agreed mechanisms, including Article 6, which we'll talk to Alona in just a few minutes. So for business, this means the outcomes mean that certainly in relation to climate finance, the potential for private sector engagement is still not yet clear, but is still going to be a discussion that is likely to happen. And it'll be interesting, particularly any insights that either Murray or Alona can give about how that may open up for opportunities for Australia and from Australia. Obviously, the carbon market is going to be one that's going to be talked about an awful lot over the next year and a half. And what's that going to look like? How do companies participate? Do they put it into their transition planning going forward? Other issues like the gender and Indigenous inclusion, like the biodiversity COP, are going to be instrumental because the work program of Indigenous inclusion at the COP is still ongoing. There was a fear that it was going to be shut down, but there is now the potential for enhanced equity and collaboration going forward. Therefore, what does business do with that kind of engagement in relation to not only transition planning, but also general discussion with key stakeholders on materiality assessment in relation to climate risk going forward? We then get to the COP that's not a COP, and that was the UNEPC, UNINC 5, because it's the fifth discussions. And this was the meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including that of the marine environment. Now, simply put, nothing happened. There was negotiation and there was perhaps commitment for future negotiation in relation to a text that was put before the parties to the committee, which included Australia as a party to these negotiations, but there was no outcome. There was a recognition of progress, which is perhaps heartening, but unlike the other two COPs, which ran over 2 weeks, this pre-COP meeting only went for 4 days, in fact, 4.5 days. So it didn't actually, in one sense, get the ability to have the momentum to create that urgency of the need for an outcome. So what has happened in this particular case is, again, a commitment to another meeting. And in this case, they've called it INC 5.2. So this will be a resumption of the existing negotiations that were already convened. And what's heartening about this is that they will take the text that's already been agreed to, as well as what's called the non-paper, which is a paper that's brought forward, but nobody necessarily owns its content, but at least it's a discussion point, to see if they can actually inform the negotiations and find some form of common ground for the potential for an outcome sometime by the end of next year at the latest, in which case they could then go into a COP process. So for business at the moment, this is a bit of an unsettling time, particularly if you are in the plastics, oil and gas and or waste-related or packaging sectors, because you're not sure as to what are the rules in relation to compliance. We do know that today, the 10th of December, the national and state and territory environment ministers in Australia made a certain range of commitments in relation to issues of circularity, but there was no specific reference to packaging and plastics in particular. So we're not seeing that certainty that is needed for transition from plastics particularly in our waste stream. The other is that we don't see any indication as to how the ongoing negotiations are going to be, or the commitments made under the negotiations are going to be funded. And that's going to be obviously a concern for business going forward. So there is an inherent risk for business at the moment in relation to what the potentiality for outcomes from this particular process are going to be. The last, and it's still going, is the UNCCD. This is a COP that's not talked about terribly much, and yet Australia is a party to it. the Conference of the Party to the UN Convention on to Combat Desertification. This year it's being held in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and it is literally still going as we speak. It's interesting, though, that at the moment, its outcomes are quite encouraging. And if you look at that which is agreed to as at the weekend, they include some important insights, I think, for agriculture, food, and particularly land-based sector businesses in Australia. Again, Australia is a party to this COP, and so some of the outcomes will no doubt come back and feed into domestic law and policy, and certainly guidance and regulation going forward. So it'll be interesting to see whether it's on sand and dust storms. And Australia, interestingly, has done a lot of work in relation to arresting dust storms in agriculture activity, such that we almost have none at the moment that are recorded, which is very interesting. And so we are providing some of the insights in relation to best farming practice for the proposed agreement or cooperation agreement that could actually be entered into at the UNCCD. The third COP that talks about gender is an interesting one, because in this particular case, the issue on the potential consensus for gender responsive approaches and collective gender disaggregated data, along with empowering women in sustainable land management, is something that I guess, because of where the COP was coming from, was not expected to be on the agenda, and yet it is on the agenda. So it'll be interesting, because that has a significant impact in relation to the livelihoods in developing countries. We're also potentially going to see some activity in relation to policies on integrating rangelands, international policies, and this new Science Committee on Sustainable Land Use Systems is potential for new investment in relation to agriculture and regenerative tools that would be used on land going forward. So some exciting prospects that are yet to eventuate, and for particularly the benefit of the BCSDA Australia members, they will be shared going forward. But now let's hit our think tank, our reflection tank, and ask Murray and Ilona to join me on screen and take off their microphones. And I guess the first thing I would like to know, because this is particularly COP29, was one of the first COPs I haven't been to for some time. You both went. I'd love to hear from you, particularly as that COP was commentated and criticised from a number of different angles and sources as to it being held in a petro-state. It, from the perspective of some, particularly reporting from The Guardian, indicated that perhaps the COP presidency wasn't necessarily totally aligned to the aspirations of the COP or the Paris Agreement, and that it was potentially dark days for it to be a success. And yet on the other side, we had our own climate change minister, Minister Bowen, who was front and centre in relation to the climate financing negotiations. So I'd love to hear from both of you as to what struck you about this particular COP. Was there something that either from a logistics or from a people perspective or the negotiations that you thought, haven't seen that before? So we might start with Ilona and then we'll go to Murray.
Great, thanks, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to be joining everyone this evening. I'm coming through to you from the lands of the Vacanti and Ladayata tribes down in northern Victoria, on the road for work this week. But I'd like to just also join in paying respects to elders past and present, and recognizing that a key component of the negotiations, as Andrew has already sort of noted, both in the climate COP, which I was able to observe, but also in biodiversity and CCD, is the importance of the role and the ongoing connection of traditional knowledge and the information that we sort of should be learning from local communities and Indigenous peoples around the world. And that's always something that strikes me at the COPs, is the strong presence and voice for those Indigenous communities, and you see that on show both visually but also in the rooms where those agenda items are being negotiated. talking a little bit about logistics. To be honest, the Azerbaijani presidency did a really good job on the logistics of the COP. It worked really, really smoothly. The venue was a coherent venue that, where things worked. And the buses, the registration, getting through security,
Wow.
all of those things worked really, really well. And I think something that was in stark contrast to Dubai and COP28 was the scale of the event. It really was scaled down quite significantly. And you notice that partly in terms of the venue size and scale, but also just in terms of the spaces for engagement, sort of both the negotiating
Mm.
rooms, but also the area where all the pavilions, the country pavilions, and other sort of events were being held. I think we went from 100,000 in UAE down to about 60,000 official participants. But I think, on the ground, it really felt more like a kind of 30,000 person COP in the time that I was there, which meant that, it's still massive, but there was a lot more interaction and engagement and an opportunity to actually get around to the different pavilions to hear and learn from people from around the world around the initiatives that they're doing across all the different aspects of mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, science, forests, oceans. So that was something that I think was done well. And the other thing with the pavilions was again that they were all in the one place. So you had that
Right.
process of
Mm.
walking past something and going, that looks interesting, I'll stop and listen to it. Instead of in Dubai, you had to know where you were going, find
Going, yeah.
the pavilion, go into the pavilion, and that was the only pavilion and the only sort of space was dedicated to whether it's Australia or
Mm.
the Pacific or the Nordic pavilion. So it was good having that sort of everything together. So there was a lot more interaction, I think, amongst stakeholders through that process, and that includes sort of with the negotiators and the government representatives, but also with the participants from civil society and other stakeholder groups. So that I think is on the plus side. I think all of that actually worked really well. Um, the the sort of criticisms around the approach of the presidency. Um, I mean, I think we always expected there to be a strong voice in support of the what I'll call transition, rather than going outright talking about the the fact that Azerbaijan has a strong sort of oil and gas economy. I think in the opening statement there was a reference to um, natural gas being something that was
A
very
gift from God.
yes, that I'm glad you said that rather than me.
I think
But
that's a
yeah,
quote from the president.
it is a quote from the president, and I think set the tone for a lot of the discussions around
Right.
ambition.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I feel like the discussion around the global stock take, the broader mitigation work program on ambition, any discussions around future NDCs, it felt like a lot of that was ultimately pushing uphill and trying to
Mm.
hold the line and prevent backsliding, rather than any sort of scope to really progress and advance the texts that had come out of Dubai the year before, and also from Glasgow as well. So that sort of it was one of the sort of themes, I think, of the COP. On the downside, there were also some interesting moves sort of used by the presidency to kickstart the negotiations and to sort of try and get early progress. I think sort of taking a leaf out of the approach that was taken for the loss and damage fund.
Yeah.
And we'll come to Article 6 in a minute. But that sort of play was used, and I think there was quite a bit of criticism for actually using that again, and because you don't necessarily want that to become, um, a tool that's used, every COP to show progress when, there are questions around due process and the way in which decisions should be taken. Um, so that's another sort of point on that sort of overarching management of the event from a presidency perspective.
Mm.
But I might sort of pause there and sort of hand over to Murray for his sort of thoughts as well.
Yeah, particularly Murray, is just before you start, you've gone in the
Yeah.
past as a journo. This time you went
Yes.
as, amongst others, BCSD Australia. So I don't know if there's a
Yes.
radical difference between the two, but I'm interested
Well,
to hear your reflections, given you've been to so many as well.
it is a very different experience, I must say, because I
Okay.
wasn't obliged to follow the main negotiations as closely as you do as a journalist. But yes, as you mentioned, Andrew, I did attend. I attended the second week of the COP, thanks to the generous support of BCSDA, and I have a couple of reflections, which yeah, I'll start off, and feel free to just gently or abruptly tell me to shut up if I go on too long, Andrew.
I'll
But
just, I'll hover over the mute button. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, please do. Firstly, as Ilona said, look, it was a weak presidency. I think the problem with this COP, when it started, people thought the COP's presidential problem was going to be US President-elect Donald Trump. In fact, it turned out to be the Azerbaijani COP presidency, and that added an extra layer of complexity to what is an enormously complex task. Secondly, I think that, it's sort of confirmed for everybody that the COP process has to change, that it's not really well suited to the demands that are now being placed upon it. And at least one aspect of that change is now widely agreed, which is the need to better bring together climate and biodiversity. And I think we can expect to see much stronger linkages between those two at Brazil at COP30. I think that was very clear. I went to a couple of side events where there were politicians or bureaucrats from Brazil, and it was very clear that they were determined to do that. That is not the only change that we probably need to think about with the COP process, and a lot of thought will need to go, into this over the next year or so as to how the COP process is retooled so it better serves modern needs, I guess. Thirdly, people called this the finance COP, but I don't actually think that's an entirely accurate description. Unfortunately, I think a more accurate description is that it was a nothing much but finance COP. And if you scratch around for what else, came out of it, apart from the new finance pledge, which in itself was not a particularly ambitious outcome. There are a few things, but essentially there is not that much there.
Mm.
In particular, the COP made no advance on starting to phase down fossil fuels, which is a
Mm.
deeply disappointing and problematic result. And it does have ramifications for the next few COPs, probably particularly for COP31, which will be the COP that Australia and the Pacific are hoping to co-host in 2026. And I suspect there'll be some people out there who would say, oh, well, if it's going to be Australia that's, supposed to put the focus back on fossil fuels, that's not going to happen because we're such a big exporter of fossil fuels at the moment.
Mm.
While that's true, I think that is a bit of a bit of a defeatist and misguided view. Firstly, Australia can see, the government can see the many opportunities that will come from new export industries like green iron or green chemicals. And secondly, Australia would be co-hosting the COP31 with the Pacific. And many of the countries in the Pacific, they're determined to see action on fossil fuels. A lot of them are very involved, for example, in an initiative called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there's no way that those countries are going to let Australia be asleep at the wheel on fossil fuels if we do get the sort of the honour, I guess, of hosting COP31. Uh, Another thing, I guess, on finance, the end result was famously 300 billion annually, when it's widely acknowledged that what developing countries need is 1.3 trillion annually. And that 300 billion target is not required to be met until 2035 and is expected to come from a range of public, private, and philanthropic sources.
Mm.
So, what happened on that front? What went wrong? Firstly, I think we can probably partly blame the presidency, as Alona mentioned, and I think that's true. They weren't really up to the job. But also I think this was possibly never going to be, well, certainly never going to be a COP that was capable really of delivering 1.3 trillion as a goal. I think if it was going to, we would have seen a concerted campaign with the COP presidency actively involved over the course of the past 12 months with the aim of landing that figure, or at least the aim of landing a figure somewhere close to it. It's probably actually, look, I don't know a huge amount about finance. You wouldn't have to talk to me for very long to realize that, but it's probably actually not that hard to raise 1.3 trillion a year. From the old rich countries and the new rich countries, some modest levels levies on shipping and aviation and on fossil fuel production, and maybe a tiny tax on shared transactions, for example. And you'd probably be close to being there, and no one would really notice. But the climate ministers and the environment ministers that are at a COP, at a climate COP, are never going to be the sort of people who are capable of making those sorts of decisions and bringing those sorts of levies to life. And that
No.
will be need to be done elsewhere. It's work that needs to be advanced by finance ministers, by leaders through forums such as the G7 and G20, and by multinational banks such as the World Bank and the IMF. Um, which sort of brings me to maybe, I guess, my final point, that perhaps one of the potentially very important developments that occurred in the first week of COP was the formal launch of a coalition for solidarity levies. And this was arranged by the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, which I think launched at COP28, and which is an alliance that is led by France, Barbados, and Kenya, and which now has 17 members, including Fiji. And the task force has already released a landmark report on the potential for these kinds of levies. And its lines of inquiry also include a fossil fuel subsidy phase out, which is very
Mm.
pertinent to Australia. And the task force is now developing concrete proposals which the coalition will advance, and which the coalition will advance and sort of advocate for, and those will be up for discussion at the IMF and World Bank meetings in April and elsewhere. Um, so yeah, I might leave it there.
I didn't need you
I
once. So there you
know.
go.
I was nervous, but
Well,
you
your
didn't.
second point went to one that I didn't highlight, which was the discussion that's actually happening at the moment at the UNCCD. And I guess it's because it's the last for the year, and so it's an opportunity for there to be reflection as a result of the other two COPs having been held. But there is actually a discussion going on about operationalizing synergies between all of the MEUs.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
this was started in Sharm, because I can remember going to the climate biodiversity or nature bridging meeting that was held back then, and then there was another one in Dubai as well. But it's interesting and instructive, I think, to see that the UNCCD has brought it into their work program. I doubt we'll see anything of any great moment, but at least we've got a conversation going, to your very point,
But
um,
Andrew,
a,
it's interesting if you
a
go
moment
back
ago.
if you go back historically, the COP agenda going back to the early 2000s, 2005, 2006, 2007, always had an agenda
I
item
know.
around synergies between MEAs. It used to be
And they
standard to think about
disappeared.
how they work together, and then
They would
it
talk
sort
to
of
one another.
ultimately.
Yep.
But I mean, it's great to see it coming back, and I think we're now at a point where we do need that, that coordination across the processes, because
Yeah.
the climate, biodiversity, and pollution sort of emergencies are all completely interlinked.
Yes.
Speaking of coming back,
Um,
let's go back to Article 6 because I'm
Mhm.
conscious of time. And Ilona, I particularly would value what is Article 6 for dummies and what was agreed to at this COP, and I guess what needs to be done next to operationalise what was agreed to.
Mhm. Okay, so Article 6 comprises three cooperative approaches. The first is Article 6.2, which is a decentralized approach for engagement between states to transfer international mitigation outcomes. And that can be, basically on the basis of approaches that are determined as and between the states. Article 6.4 is a centralised mechanism, a bit like a sort of clean development mechanism plus, which essentially talks to a centralised system overseen by a supervisory body, which sets the rules for, trading in a new form of unit that represents emission reductions, known as a 6.4 emission reduction unit. And then Article 6.8 talks to non-market mechanisms. And these provisions were included in the Paris Agreement in 2015, but it's taken almost 10 years to fully operationalise the approaches. Article 6.2 cooperative approaches have been ongoing for quite a few years. A couple of countries have sort of started developing their own frameworks and rules, working within the broader framework of rules that were agreed to in Katowice as part of the Paris Agreement rulebook. But there were a number of outstanding issues that needed to be resolved in both, particularly in Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. A lot of these sort of outstanding or crunchy issues really went towards the processes for authorization, the timing of what's called first transfer in the context of when is an IPMO first transferred from and recorded from when it goes from one country to or registry system to another. And then also sort of debates around the registry systems and processes and how they will interact with each other and also with the 6.4 mechanism registry. I mentioned at the outset, one of the early wins, as it were, was in respect of Article 6.4. That was specifically in respect to the endorsement of sort of two standards that had been critical to the development of the 6.4 architecture. So the supervisory had the month before its meeting approved a standard for the development and assessment of methodologies, which is sort of critical to underpinning what approaches will be and what activities will be authorised or capable of authorisation. And then a second standard that provided guidance on activities involving carbon removals. And typically those standards from the supervisory board will come back to the parties at the CMA for consideration and then ultimately a decision taken by the parties to adopt those standards. What the COP president did at the beginning of the session at the opening was to present the standards and and the parties took note of these standards. So rather than the parties approving them, they took note of what the supervisory body
Yeah.
had approved, which was, basically prevented the standards being reopened and sort of prosecuted during the course of
Prosecuted,
the
yeah.
negotiating, which is what had happened in previous COPs where that had just then unwound all of the negotiations on markets because you were sort of arguing over the standards as opposed to the things like the authorization processes. but adopting those upfront wasn't the end of the story for markets, and that whilst it was a positive step forward, we still needed guidance on the authorization processes and first transfer in 6.2, and then also similarly authorizations and registry processes in 6.4. There's quite a lot of technical detail involved in that. So, I won't go into too much detail around, the content, but what we have now got in Article 6.2 is, clear guidance on what authorizations are needed and when, and how they can be given by the parties, including sort of a guidance on what, an appropriate authorization might look like, but without being overly prescriptive and saying, it must be done in that way. There's also clarification around what happens if a party looks to change the authorization. And essentially, there won't be an endorsement of changes to authorizations where ITMOs have been first transferred unless a party actually says in its authorization that it can do so. So essentially, it's providing a threshold that will give a little bit of confidence to the market that, if an ITMO has been transferred, it's not likely to be sort of, the authorization status isn't likely to be removed. So that was quite important.
Right. Yeah.
There's also been sort of some guidance around how to manage transparency and how what's called the centralized accounting and reporting platform will interact and perform, both in terms of storing information about authorizations, but also sort of managing some of the approaches to consistency checks. And there was a lot of discussion and debate about what happens where there are inconsistencies, what sort of processes will be followed to deal with that, including what was sort of one of the crunchy issues was what happens if there are significant and persistent inconsistencies, and how should they be resolved, both when there's that initial sort of electronic check and then when the technical review teams come in. So that was another area where there was sort of further guidance provided and clarifications. And then finally, in the context of registries, the decision does clarify the connection between the 6.4 mechanism registry, participating party registries, and the international registry, and so how that fits in with the central accounting and reporting platform, and sort of notes that there's the ability for data from that platform to be pooled, so that you can effectively provide a greater access to registry services, particularly for those parties that don't have national registries. So that was very helpful in the context of Article 6.2. Article 6.4 basically, again, has some further guidance around assigning authorization status to the 6.4 emission reduction units. And it is also sort of basically urging the Secretariat to sort of move quickly to get the mechanism registry up and running as quickly as possible. There is more work for the supervisory body to do, and they've got quite an ambitious work plan for 2025. But the mechanism, the sort of agenda items that deal with Article 6 are not coming back, I think, until I want to say 2028, when there'll be a review of the mechanism. So there won't be standing negotiations other than reports back from the supervisory body, and that more general reporting back on implementation rather than decisions to be taken on operationalization.
So let me give you a hypothetical. Business walks in and says, we've heard about Article 6 being passed. We're interested in knowing more and how we can play a role. What would you be giving advice about engaging in what comes out of Article 6?
Well, I think, all of it comes down to what do you want to do and where? Because the key things is for Article 6 to be progressed, you need the participating parties to firstly have met all their participation requirements and then put in place the frameworks and architecture to be able to provide authorizations, to have a registry to enable sort of the recording of units and transfers, and to
Yeah.
undertake corresponding adjustments. I mean, that's in the Article sort of 6.2 space. So it's kind of, where do you want to go, and do the governments that you need to engage with have systems in place to start doing these cooperative approaches, and if not, what needs to be done to build that capacity and work through with that. With 6.4, I think it's more straightforward now, but we're still waiting for methodologies to be approved by the supervisory body. There is a process that is transitioning sort of quite a bit of the CDM architecture into the 6.4 mechanism. That includes a review of methodologies against the enhanced sort of frameworks and requirements for the 6.4 mechanism. And then also a number of sort of project activities have, applied to transition across as well. And then they will need to be sort of reviewed again against the criteria for, and particularly relating to sort of higher integrity for 6.4. But I think there's, potentially going to be some really good opportunities for 6.4 activities to be developed, once we have a little bit more detail around those initial methodologies. And so I think there's, I'm pretty optimistic about us sort of seeing the first Article 6.4 emission reduction units issued next year, and a process to see that mechanism scale, and ultimately, because it is an internationally recognised and endorsed mechanism, it may provide sort of I guess that uplift around what we expect around integrity of carbon markets, and set essentially that global standard, and create a fungible unit that can potentially serve a role across a number of different emissions trading schemes and platforms, including looking at how that then feeds into sort of schemes like Corsia for the aviation sector.
Yeah. So what has seemed like an eternity has now come to fruition, or at least the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, or something. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Murray, you went and talked with an awful lot of people while you were there. I'd be interested in hearing what you were hearing about, I guess, the COP, but I guess more importantly, what people or the sentiment was in relation to climate action of those that you were talking to. Would you come away half glass empty, half glass full? You did mention the change, or the upcoming change in the US administration, conscious that wasn't as significant as perhaps a number of thought, but it can't not have an impact. What were you hearing when you were talking to people?
Well, I think so. People say, "Oh, a climate COP is just a talk fest." There is an element, of course, that is true. I think one of the important things to realize is that a COP is where many people whose voices are never heard, many countries, many groups, many communities whose voices are never heard, where they do actually get
Do
heard.
actually get heard? Yeah.
So, so it is a talk fest in a very important way. And one of the things I did there, because I was doing some podcasts from there, was to just do basically went down the corridors of that delegates pavilion that Alona mentioned, and just did some vox pops with delegates from the various some of the various organizations there, and some of them are incredibly moving because it actually brings these abstract concepts like adaptation and loss and damage. it brings them back. Like you get a real reality check that those just aren't abstract terms. I remember speaking to a woman from a group based in Pakistan. It was established by somebody that you two might have known. Like he died recently, Salamil Hook, Huq.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was a
No, well,
significant
Yeah,
Pakistani.
Salim Huq, he was leading the
Yes,
climate program at
yeah,
IIED, the International Institute
yeah,
for
yes,
Environment and Development, and led a
yeah,
lot of the work with the LDCs. I
yeah.
worked closely with him in early 2000s on when I was in London.
Ah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
but an
small
absolute
world after
legend
all.
in
Yes.
the adaptation and loss and damage space, and he drove a lot of the thinking along with Benito Muller from Oxford
Yes, yeah,
ECBI on that with the LTC group.
Yes, and yes, and quite a wonderful man by all accounts. And I asked this woman, oh, there's been so many terrible events in Pakistan. So uh, has has adaptation become more of an issue? And she said, oh no, well, adaptation is always an issue. So basically, whether or not farmers or communities have got any external help, they have to try and adapt, even if they're trying to adapt with nothing, with no external input. And that was quite a moving thing to hear. And other people talking about health, how the health impacts of climate change are gradually starting to rise up the agenda, and some business people as well. One of my favorite quotes when I was doing these Vox Pops was somebody who I was told was the sustainability manager with the largest fast food chain in Scandinavia. And he used the phrase, which possibly you two have heard. I hadn't heard it before, but I did think it was wonderful, that partnership is leadership. And from a business perspective, and the businesses do have to look for ways to forge partnerships with other businesses, with academics, with governments, so long as they're sane, with all sorts of entities, that is going to be the key if we're to ramp up ambition to the extent that we need. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but those were
well,
my,
but you gave me a
my
good segue, which is ambition. So let's talk
yeah,
COP30. A
right.
quick and final question.
Mm.
Um, what do you think is going to happen? And are you going? So we'll
Uh,
go with Murray first, and then
yeah.
Ilona. Ilona will finish off. So Murray.
Well, there's a number of factors that will determine whether I go, I guess. I'm a little bit nervous that I think the Brazilian COP presidency will be fantastic.
Mm.
I think all the signs were there. I'm sure Ilona would agree that they are just, this is going to be a, a COP that is going to deliver on the fronts that they choose. Now, they've got the added layer that finance is an unfinished business. They will be the ones that have to come up with 1.3 trillion. This last COP didn't. They have to come up with, well, they don't actually have to come up with the amount, but they have to come up with a believable strategy. And the next 12 months, they will have to sort of lay the groundwork for that. Um, Nature will be big.
Mm.
Yeah, so that will be the focus. That's, I guess, my thoughts on it.
Yeah,
Ilona.
I agree with Murray. I think the Brazilians are masterful diplomats, and they will, I think, do an amazing sort of job as presidency. Um, I think the unfinished business is all about ambition. We have the NDCs which are due,
Yeah.
February, but I think most countries will probably miss that deadline, and it'll be sort of, throughout the year as they come in. And in that respect, I think they will have a big job to sort of make sure that there's progress on the mitigation work program, and the global stock take, and bring that back to looking at how there is progress around the commitments that have already come through, or that have been on the table with respect to renewables, energy efficiency, demand side management, the fossil fuel phase down, all of that language that was in that cover text and sort of GST outcomes. We've got to see progress on that, and that will be sort of firmly in their court, along with finance and nature. So they've got a big agenda to deal with, and query how big BLM is to sort of host and deal with the number of people that would typically descend on a COP as well. So that's going to be an added sort of thing to think about, how they actually manage logistics, and whether parts of the COP are perhaps distributed to other parts of the country.
Yeah.
Can I just say, sorry, I just want to say, Andrew, I think the COP presidency this year, but the Brazilian COP presidency will be telling us that nature is a gift from God. I don't think we'll hear anything about fossil fuels. We mightn't see much action on fossil fuels, but certainly, nature will be front and center.
Right. Yes. Who knows what Chris Bowen says in 2026 during COP31. I'm still hearing that Belém will be the high-level ministerial meeting, and then the rest of the COP will actually be held in Rio de Janeiro. And that comes from the other element that I think will indicate the success of that COP, which is business working in lockstep with Lula da Silva's administration is very, very strong. And I know that because the person who's doing that is my counterpart in Brazil. They are really working very hard to make that COP a true success, not just for Brazil, but for the world. So it's very encouraging to see those people working very hard. So big thank you for your contribution this evening. That was much appreciated. It went a little longer than I thought it was going to, but didn't want to stop that conversation. It was just so rich. With the wrap up, I just wanted to give a quick highlight, because those who have registered to attend will be getting a link to the information in another form on this screen. But the outputs from WBCSD during the course of all of the COPs, including the one that's still going, you can see up on the screen, and one of them is interesting, given the comments that were made. I'm just trying to find where it is. Where is it? That's right. The repurposing subsidies for equitable and regenerative agriculture and the role of business. A white paper was published for the first time by WBCSD, looking at the question of perverse subsidies. We know that our colleagues from Business for Nature have been talking about this for some time, but this is the first time WBCSD has embraced the narrative as well. And like the commentary that's been made around subsidies in fossil fuel, I think we're going to see that be a real line item for further discussion going forward next year into that COP, and potentially into COP31 as well. But you will find on this document the links to all of the releases of information and resources that WBCSD has put out during the course of the COPs +1. And for those BCSDA members, you'll continue to get your links to the trackers that we've been having for the individual COPs themselves. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. We will populate the names and the emails and the links to those who have been speaking today for you to follow through, should you wish to follow up on anything that you've heard from them. A big thank you to Murray and to Ilona for their contribution and for their support throughout the year. This can't happen without them. So I do thank you, and thank the members for their contribution. This is the last official act apart from the AGM on Thursday. Don't forget to register, Ilona, if you haven't already, even if you are going to be online. I need to make sure I've got a quorum. But that was a sidebar. Thank you to all of the members for their support throughout the year. we can't operate without you, and we hope that the value and the impact that we've been creating has been of value to both you and also the objectives under our charter. But for now, Andrew Peterson is my name. Thank you so much for joining us, who've been able to join us online, and for those who've been watching the recording. Looking forward to seeing you all in 2025. Thank you once again, and goodbye. Bye for now.
Bye. Thanks.